So welcome everybody to the Wolf ISGAP seminar series on constructing a conceptual framework to examine contemporary anti-Semitism. So welcome everybody. We're going to start in a few minutes, give some time. I think Daphne is going to be able to assist you to open your camera so we can kind of create a bit of a virtual community vibe.
So as we wait, I'll be promoting everybody from attendee to panelist. So if you get my request, please accept it so that you can participate in the webinar and turn on your cameras. If I miss your name somehow, just raise your virtual hand and I'll go back and make sure to send you a new invite.
So welcome everybody. Hello, Richard. Shalom Sima. Daniel. So we're going to start in a few minutes. If everybody could try to turn on their cameras, it would be great to kind of create a sense of a community.
Okay, well, okay.
Okay, we're going to start in a moment. I'll give it one more minute.
So as I see, more people are joining by the second. So if you didn't catch my message before, I'll be promoting you from attendee to panelist so that you can turn on your camera and participate in the lecture. If I missed you, please raise your virtual hand and I'll make sure to go back and add you on to the call as a panelist. Thank you.
Okay, so Bill, should I introduce you?
Yeah, Daniel's here. We're everybody's here.
Oh, Daniel's here? Excellent. Okay. So welcome everybody and thank you for being here for another session. This is the Wolf Institute of Cambridge and the ISGAP seminar series on constructing a conceptual framework to examine issues of contemporary anti-Semitism or processes of contemporary anti-Semitism. So today we have an esteemed scholar and friend of ISGAP, Daniel Feldman. Daniel is an assistant professor of English at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He's a specialist in issues concerning Holocaust literature and young adult fiction of the Holocaust. I had the honor of meeting Daniel an era ago at Yale when we were younger and, and vibrant. So Daniel, and Daniel's working
and more innocent.
And Daniel's been working on aspects of the Follow the Money project from a intellectual, scholarly perspective. So Daniel, it's an honor that you're here. Thanks for taking the time. And our colleague, Bill Kohlbrenner, will be sort of a discussant when Daniel's finished. Daniel and William are colleagues. And I think William will be sort of a discussant and kind of encourage a conversation and dialogue at the end of Daniel's presentation. So Daniel, the floor is yours and thank you very much for being here.
And thank you for having me, Charles, Bill, and the entire team. It is a pleasure to be with you and especially among many respected colleagues and familiar faces and friends. And I look forward to the conversation that will follow this. Charles, whom, as he said, I've known for quite some time in different stations of our life, has given us the mission, has given us the remit of creating a conceptual framework as opposed to just an observational and sort of symptomatic reportage of anti-Semitism, of which unfortunately we have a lot. However, I'm just going to try to create some background for a very subtle and confusing aspect of anti-Semitism that I wish to address with you today. It's not the one perhaps that even I study or know best, but it's one that I find quite striking and it seemed to fit in well within this ongoing and very innovative seminar series that Charles began, Chloe has continued, and Bill and others have participated. What I want to address with you is in the title here, making Jews responsible for anti-Semitism, how denial itself is not just a corollary or an after effect of anti-Semitism, but is in fact one of its primary manifestations, and how it is in fact a form of anti-Semitism itself, rather than something that is that it comes after the fact. And to do that, it's very counterintuitive and bizarre, almost contradictory phenomenon. I will need to present a few different aspects of this. I want to begin back in the period, obviously not the beginning of anti-Semitism, but in the period that I know well from my own work as a scholar of the Holocaust. And to do that, I'm going to just signal where I took this title from for the final stage of anti-Semitism is denial, sort of a riff or a nod to something that was written during the war, during the Holocaust itself, when Jews became very aware that there was this act of denial, not something afterwards, not something that followed, but rather, I hope I'm still with you, but rather something that they understood during the war itself. And the writing that I want to share with you is one that comes from the Warsaw Ghetto Archive, from what's called the Oneg Shabbos effort, something that perhaps some of you have heard of. It was an underground effort in Warsaw, spearheaded by a historian, sociologist historian, something that perhaps Charles can identify with, someone named Emanuel Ringelblum, who gathered a very large and diverse team of colleagues in the Warsaw Ghetto. They called themselves the Oneg Shabbos, not because they were religious. There were some religious members, most of them were not, because they gathered on Saturday when they had, I don't want to say more time, but there actually was, but there was an opportunity to gather outside of the forced labor that almost all of them were conscripted to, and they had various cells. Within that effort, there was, let me go to it here. There was a secretary, a young woman, not someone who is that well known. Here is the actual, this is the name, this is it in Polish. Ostatnim etapem przesiedlenia jest śmierć. This is something that was written in 1942 by someone whose name is Gustawa Jarecka. You can see her years right here. Let me share with you also her picture. She was very intelligent and multilingual, polyglot individual. She had this job. I hope you can see her face. It deserves to be remembered. And here you have a sense of someone much like any of us, or a younger version, those of us younger, someone in the prime of her life, then age 34, 35, who was given a job in the secretariat, in the director's office of the Judenrat, because of her ability in German, Polish, French, and Yiddish, and was therefore an immediate witness to the Great Deportation, the Grossaktion, the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. In the years of that seminal, that terrible year of 1942, the Jews in Warsaw saw the destruction of their community, and they labored under the illusion, which was perfectly logical, that if only they could get word out what was really happening, the world would rally to their salvation. They hadn't yet lived through the Holocaust. They were living through it then. The illusion that we see as somewhat perhaps naive was completely logical. There was no reason to think that Americans, British, the French, that they would not take immediate action if only they knew. And clearly, It was the denial, the suppression of the truth that was killing them. And so she was commissioned as one of the people closest to the organization of the lists working in the Judenrat committee. She was asked by the Oneg Shabbos, by Ringelblum in the secret archive, to write a report, and she titles it, the title of what that Polish word is the last station of resettlement is death. That the resettlement was a lie. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the Oneg Shabbos archive, there is an entire tome that has her title, this report, as its lead, its lead publication, in which they document in exhaustive detail exactly what was happening. We can find this, and I'll show you just a little bit of it. Here is again, this is the background, the scholarly background to it. There is report after report with maps of Treblinka, reports of Chelmno in 1942 and early 1943 that were exhaustive documentation attempts in order to get out the word. So they really did understand the significance of the denial and suppression. Of course, what they were wrong about was not logical. They were wrong sort of morally. They didn't understand, and we still don't understand that, thus we are meeting today. That denial is not just an after effect. It's not something that if people just knew what was happening to Jews, but that it is an expression. It is a phenomenon. It is a direct medium of anti-Semitism. Someone who did understand this, and this I'll go to my next source, again from the war, and this is a horrible source, not from someone like Yaretska, who in fact herself, she was killed in January 1943 with her children on a train, but rather from someone on the other side, the primary architect of the final solution, Himmler. And Himmler, and here I will share with you a sound. This is I apologize for giving one of the worst anti-Semitism of history a platform, but he really did understand that denying anti-Semitism, denying what they were doing to the people who were doing, to some of the chief perpetrators, was a key element of the crime. And here we're going to watch, we'll listen to about 3 minutes of what he says, and there is simultaneous translation on the page. This is from something, and I'll talk over it for a minute, and then we'll listen to Himmler in his own words. It's remarkable. There is a recording of the speech in October 1943 in Posen, and now Poznan. Himmler addressed on 2 days, for the 4th and the 6th, senior SS officers. There is a transcript in his own word, and there is a recording of his voice. This is actually Himmler's.
Auch am Schluss des Krieges aufrechnen können, dartun können, eine sehenswerte und beachtliche Leistung sein. Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen in aller Offenheit nennen. Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein, und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Genauso wenig, wie wir am 30. Juni gezögert haben, die befohlene Pflicht zu tun und Kameraden, die sich verfehlt hatten, an die Wand zu stellen und zu erschießen. Wie wir darüber niemals gesprochen haben und sprechen werden. Das war so eine, Gott sei Dank, in uns wohnende Takt, Selbstverständlichkeit des Taktes, dass wir uns untereinander nie darüber unterhalten haben, nie darüber sprachen. Es hat jeden geschauert und jeder war sich klar, dass es das nächste Mal wieder tun würde, wenn es befohlen wird und wenn es notwendig ist. Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das fasst Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, alle die braven 80 Millionen Deutschen, jeder hat seinen anständigen Juden, sagt, alle anderen sind Schweine. Der ist ein prima Jude. Und so gesehen, er ist durchgestanden, hat keiner. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen beisammen liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Und das durchgehalten zu haben und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
Okay, I'm going to leave that here. I hope you can hear me because I also switched to the audio. I'm going to leave that on the screen for 1 second. Let's just note a few things in what Himmler, obviously very extreme, arch anti-Semite, has said here. This is something that we never have and never will speak about. In fact, this is, in many respects, the only recording, the only statement that we have in which they discussed it directly. And so the supposition that many of us might have, very natural supposition, kind of a layperson supposition, one that I probably had as a kid, that behind closed doors, they were talking about this directly, is not true. They did not speak about it, even amongst themselves. These are the perpetrators, these are officers, people who directly carried out the final solution, at least in Poland. And he says, we don't talk about this because our tact, as he called it, is one of our virtues. He also then says, we've gone through this and have remained good people, decent people, to do what we've had to do this patriotic service, so to speak, for the German people, has made us hard. And we are loyal because we've been able to do this and not talk about it and retain our virtue. And this final stage, and this is the sort of if there's one line from this speech that is well known, it's this. It is what we have done, the destruction of Jewry, which by this point, European Jewry, which by this point, except for the Hungarian massacre, which was to follow in the following summer, was more or less complete by Russian and Polish and Western European destruction, which had already largely been completed by this point in October 1943. It has made us hard, and as he says, ein niemals genanntes, niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt. It is a page of German of glory that has not and will never be written. It will never be named. That not talking about it is precisely part of what we have achieved. So we are good people. We're nonetheless good people. And everyone has got their good Jew, but we've had to do this out of loyalty. And it's something that we cannot and will not speak about. Here's Himmler describing it. You might think that this is, and it is, a very extreme case. I want to note, and here I just want to conclude my sort of observation. I have a few more observational points to bring up, and then we'll get to just the hypothesis. What lies behind this? This continues to this day. Last year, you may remember, and I hope you can continue to see this. Let me actually stop the share, and then, because I don't need the sound for a second, and I'll just go right back to it. There was this case. No, did it wrong with sound again. I apologize. There was a case of this businessman in, I believe it was Mormon, I actually don't remember, but in Utah. In Utah, this fellow who, here he is, Bateman, and only in Salt Lake City business circles was he known, who claimed that the Jews are engaged in genocide. This gets us a little further ahead to the next part of my argument, that it's precisely a specific crime for which Jews are responsible. It is genocide, and then I'm going to extend that to anti-Semitism itself, that the Jews are engaged in a global, as he called it, this was his email, this crazy email from last year, but as we know through ISGAP and many other efforts, these need to be addressed directly and immediately. I hope you can see what he said. There was a statistics effort underway to euthanize the American people, to kill off the Americans, and I believe Jews are behind this. Okay, that's what he said. But in his retraction, not retraction, or his clarification, this is the part that I want to draw your attention to. and I don't think he's lying. You hear this already in Himmler. I have no intention of raising a big stir, and I have nothing but love for the Jewish people. That to accuse some of my closest friends are Jews. I fear billions of people. Some of my closest friends are Jews, and yet I fear that Jews are behind this effort that is putting billions of people around the world at risk and is exterminating them. This kind of claim, on the one hand, I understand who Jews are. I have no problem. I'm a decent person. I am actually a sympathetic person. And on the other hand, that I know exactly what Jews are doing is something that appears in context after context today. It is present in the Black Lives Matter narrative. I'll turn off the sound here, but that Jews here I have it. Actually, let me just skip over this one. But that Jews are themselves Jews are themselves responsible for racism against African Americans. In a different kind, let me stop the share and I'll come back to it. Jews are also, of course, behind white replacement theory, that there is a genocide against white Americans, the replacement theory, and that is another specifically genocide that Jews are launching. And finally, I'll give you one, and then of course to come to Israel and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, two specific cases I want to draw your attention to here. One is that Jews are themselves responsible for bringing about attacks on Jews, and secondly, that Jews are engaged in genocide in Palestine, Israel. So two more short clips. I'll share some ideas, and then we'll discuss it together. This is a clip from 2015 after another one of the short wars that Israel waged against Hamas. And in the aftermath of that, there were a series of attacks, anti-Semitic attacks, murders in Europe. In Sweden, there was rather notorious, but I think very telling and representative, a significantly representative interview. It was in English with the Israeli ambassador, in which the sort of leading interviewer, investigative reporter, does these interviews in Sweden, spoke to the Israeli ambassador and said as follows.
Unfortunately, the idea that Jews are responsible for their own persecution is not some fringe idea. Take Swedish public radio, the country's equivalent of NPR. In early 2015, host Helena Groll interviewed Isaac Bachman, Israel's ambassador to Sweden, in the wake of 2 deadly anti-Semitic attacks in Europe. But Groll didn't ask the Israeli envoy what non-Jews could do to stop this virulent anti-Semitism. Instead, she asked,
do the Jews themselves have any responsibility in the growing anti-Semitism that we see now?
Bachman, unsurprisingly, was shocked.
Well, I reject the question altogether. The question of how a woman contributes for the fact of being raped is irrelevant altogether. I don't think that there's any provocation the Jews are doing. They just exist.
As we noted in an earlier video, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights has found that 60% of Swedish Jews fear to publicly identify as Jewish. That Groll, a respected member of the media, felt comfortable blaming Jews for their own abuse helps explain why. Groll didn't stop digging, however. She went on. But a lot of people would look at the Middle East today and say there is conflicts that we know between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And a lot of people might say we see the Gaza war, we see things that have been happening, that the Israelis and the Jews in Israel have a responsibility to reactions that are coming. After outrage.
Okay, so that's one more. And I think that's important because that's the problem with what Charles has been raising. These sort of anecdotal, incidental reports are themselves sort of outrageous in their own right, but we're looking for patterns. But there is something conceptually, and that brings us to our subject here. There's something conceptually significant what's being said here, and I have 2 more steps to make, and then I'll sort of rest my case. Is that the Jews are not just committing genocide, and it's genocide in many different contexts, in Palestine against Palestinians, against Black Americans, against the white Americans. And of course, with Holocaust denial itself, that Jews themselves somehow precipitated, I'll show this, that's my next step, Jews somehow precipitated the Holocaust. but Jews are in general responsible for anti-Semitism. And why that is, that's the big question. But I'm just trying to raise and it's a hard point. So it's kind of so crazy. It's a little hard to prove it, which is why I'm going into exhaustive detail to try to draw out these points. In the effort of, and this is what I was trying to find the clip for, but I misplaced my marker earlier, of why Jews are responsible in the Black Lives Matter, why Jews are perfidious in Black Lives Matter rhetoric. It's because they suck up all the space and they don't allow for discussion, they don't allow for attention to real victims, Palestine, people of color, and so on. Here is another example of that, and this is the point that I want to bring up of how Jews are themselves, how the Holocaust itself is something that people who really care about individuals of color should not mention. This was a protest just last year. This is 2021 in Vienna, and there are Palestinians or Arabs or people of color mainly who are leading the protest, waving flags here. And then you'll hear in the middle, I hope you can see it, I don't know if you can, but there is an Austrian individual who will say in the middle, I hope this plays now, there is an Austrian individual who will say, you can take the Holocaust and shove it in your rear. He's the guy in the tan. Take the Holocaust and shove it. So here is in the middle of Vienna, an individual at a protest march against Israeli aggression, claim that the Holocaust itself is a way of Jewish world control, that it itself is something that needs to be exposed. It itself needs to be, as he says, put it in your rear end. What lies behind all this? Let's talk about this more generally. So you have the perpetrators of the final solution. You have sort of garden variety, conspiracy theorists say, I have no problem with Jews, I love Jews, except that the Jews are destroying all of humanity. They wish to kill all of humanity. And let's note again that it's genocide almost regularly that they're accused of. There's the notion that Jews, as we heard in the Swedish broadcast, but this is something we hear very often, and actually has been done for a very long time, that somehow it's Jewish behavior. Philip Roth wrote about this a lot also in Bill in My World, how Jews and it's somehow in their behavior that they force anti-Semites to act the way they do. Anti-Semites are just good, decent people. And finally, in the woke world, in the world of Palestinian rights, the world of people of color, it's that Jews are taking attention away from the rightful victims, and a real anti-racist needs to have some degree of anti-Semitism. Those are the phenomena. Those are the aspects of it. I would suggest, and this is really not something that I'm going to belabor that much, but I submit to your consideration that it's, on the one hand, because of the unusual, the very anomalous nature of anti-Semitism itself that has no root cause. It's not because of Jews' relationship to the state, to the economy, the color of their skin, but rather it's just Jews that has always allowed for a shifting proximate cause. Now that because of Israel, before that is because of what they did to Europe, before that what they did to the church, what they've done to Western ideas, their threat to paganism, their threat to the empire, right? There's always another reason because there is no reason. It's unlike other hatreds and unlike other bigotries that there is no origin and that there is no remedy, and therefore it doesn't really exist. It has to be denied. Secondly, it's this aspect that Bill and Charles and David Patterson spoke about 2 weeks ago of the Jewish ambiguous identity. Are Jews part of the power structure and the elite, or are they subaltern, and are they the persecuted victims of the world? And therefore, to be anti-Semitic might in fact be patriotic. It might in fact be a sign of Black nationalism and Black pride, as we saw just a few months ago in New York City. And so you can be an anti-Semite and say, I am no racist. In fact, I am an anti-racist. I'm part of the Black Lives Matter, part of the Women's March. I am a good person, I'm virtuous. And so to call someone anti-Semite is itself, in some contexts, very sort of a mark of Cain. And therefore, it also cannot exist. On that last score, I just want to play one final clip, and then perhaps Bill will have a few comments, and then we'll have a broader discussion. And this one comes from a specific representation, Holocaust movie from a couple of years ago about the Deborah Lipstadt, the Deborah Lipstadt, David Irving trial, the movie called Denial. And this is sort of the gotcha moment in the film where Irving is shown to be not racist and says, of course, I am not a racist. And he was found, his case was dismissed. He was not successful in his case because of this idea of perhaps he was being himself untruthful. He was not being fulsome. But what I would say is that, that obviously the libel case, Lipstadt deserved to prevail. But I don't know if he was lying. For anti-Semites to say, I am no racist, and here he's saying he doesn't say I'm not an anti-Semite, he says I'm no racist, is actually consistent. The denial of racism is itself part of the racism, just as Iran today, the state, which is one of the most aggressive sources and exporters of anti-Semitism, calling for the death of millions of Jews, can claim we are no anti-Semites. We in fact like race. We in fact like Jews. So here is a film that vividly documents this in a well-done scene from the 2015 film of Denial. And we'll end with this, and then I'll turn things over to Bill, and we'll talk from there.
But if there is one thing that gets up my nose, I must admit it's this. When I switch on my television set and I see one of them reading.
Mr. Irving, who's the them and who's the us?
Trevor MacDonald.
MacDonald?
A newsreader, my lord.
A black
What is this?
Well, in fact, this is a stock speech I used to make.
Papa?
I used to say, in the good old days, the announcer would wear a dinner jacket. Now they've got women reading the news, and it's just part of a general speech.
Yes, it is our news, and they're reading it to me.
If they could have their own news, which they were reading to us, I suppose it would be very interesting. But for the time being, I'd be prepared to accept that the BBC should have a dinner-jacketed gentleman reading the important news, followed by a lady reading the less important news, followed by Trevor MacDonald giving us all the latest news on muggings and drug deals.
Rest lost in loud laughter and applause. Are you not appalled by that?
Not in the least. This was a witty speech delivered after dinner to an audience at a private club.
You were talking to a bunch of racists.
They were not. They were perfectly ordinary guests.
Ordinary people? Then why were there cheers?
Well, obviously, they liked the jokes.
Mr. Irving, I think you might be advised to have a look at your own diary, if you wouldn't mind. 38, please, Mr. Irving. 38, tab 10 of the bundle K4. A quiet evening at home. Jessica. Who is Jessica?
My little infant child.
Yes.
She was 9 months old at the time.
9 months old in September 1994. Jessica is turning into a fine little lady. She sits very upright on an ordinary chair, a product of our regular walks to the bank, I am sure. On those walks, we sing the binkety-bankety-bong song. She stars in a poem when half-breed children are wheeled past. And then you go into italics. I am a baby Aryan, not Jewish or sectarian. I have no plans to marry an ape or Rastafarian. Racist, Mr. Irving? Anti-Semitic, Mr. Irving?
I do not think so.
Teaching your little child this kind of poison?
Do you think a 9-month-old can understand words spoken in English or any other language?
This poor little child has been taught a racist ditty by her racist and perverted father.
Have you ever read Edward Lear? Hilaire Belloc?
They haven't brought a libel action, Mr. Irving. You have. You sued because you said that we had called you a racist and an extremist.
Yes. But I'm not a racist.
Mr. Irving, look at the words on the page.
So this notion of denial being the final stage of genocide, and this was the other source for my talk.
Daniel, Dr. Feldman, why don't we give you a chance to catch your breath and to
Thank you.
Have your co-presenter given the proper respect that she deserves. And I'll start off by thanking Dr. Feldman for the talk. And Daniel, I would just you covered so much. I was wondering if you could just circle back to a couple of things that I thought would benefit from better elucidation. First of all, you started with that really amazing account of the Oneg Shabbos, this organization as you describe it, and particularly the young woman. I mean, my first question, let's just start with that one. So how did that serve as the seed to get us to where we ended up, which is with this expression of this vehement anti-Semitism of Irving in denial?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this notion that there was, I think it comes back to the initial idea, which I think any one of us would have, that if only we reported what was happening, if only upstanding individuals recognized and were made aware of the hatred that we face, it would rally people of a good conscience to action. They were right about all the same. I think many of us act out of those same motivations, but it misconstrues one essential part of anti-Semitism. That part of it is its denial. And they really did not, they saw that the idea was that the Nazis were keeping a secret, but they did not understand that the world itself practices this sort of, and it perhaps even is. I mean, if someone just asked in the Q&A, why does this seem to persist on the news today? That it actually might be, in many ways, might be eager to hear your ideas, Dr. Nelson's, other people, then it might even be the most prevalent form of anti-Semitism. That if denial of anti-Semitism itself is a form of anti-Semitism, it's sort of the entry level. It is the starter form of anti-Semitism. There is no doubt. Amy Schumer had a brilliant skit about this a couple months ago, or maybe a couple of years ago. I don't know when it was posted, where there was sort of like a very benign or very mild anti-Semitism, and she's saying, like, does anybody hear this? And only, of course, that notion.
How does that denial
itself, sort of anti-Semitism itself is itself practiced in the denial of it, is something that I think the example of the Oneg Shabbos group, the example of people who did know, and I'm always struck by that, this canard. It's not a canard, but it's just something that many of us, even today, don't realize how much they knew that there's this idea of this is something that I work on. So this goes a little deeper into your question, Bill, and it's the last thing I'll say about it, that there's this sort of dramatic irony that somehow we know, because of historical understanding, we know things about anti-Semitism that they did not. And I'm saying some of that. But on the other hand, they knew full well. There are maps in that Oneg Shabbos, there are maps in her report of Treblinka. But and I think we still struggle to understand, is how the denial, blaming Jews for their own destruction, blaming Jews for attacks on them, is something that many people who would not at all call themselves anti-Semites practice very, very frequently.
Right. I want to get to people's questions in just one second, but I wanted to ask you a couple more things. I was just thinking of the novel by Aaron Appelfeld called Badenheim 1939 in its English translation, which is about an Austrian spy, and the Jews are in total denial about what's going to happen to them until the Nazis are basically down the road, right? So I was wondering also, what does contemporary denial, let's say among Jews in the university look like? And how does that, I mean, this is a discussion we happen often at ISGAP. How is that denial possible, given the just enormous set of evidence? So how especially among, there are two phenomena. One is the university in general, and then the other is Jews within the university.
So I don't know if this is restricted to university, but university itself might be sort of the apogee, might be the exemplar of our faith in humanity. University as our bastion, our cathedral. It is our institution of enlightenment, puts faith in people that with knowledge, they will do the right thing. Right? If you dare to know, as Kant said, you will be put to right action. And you can say much more about this than I can, Bill, as can others here. But study of anti-Semitism will time and time again betray your faith unfortunately, in humanity. That it is not necessarily true. And therefore, the anti-Semitism in the university, which many of you have done so much to document, is particularly galling, not because it's unique to universities, but because it seems so contradictory to the ethos of universities. But really, it's something that, again, Yaretska, Ringelblum, the colleagues, their colleagues in the Warsaw Ghetto were wrestling with, that people will come to our defense if only they knew. And the denial itself is not something that we want to believe, because we're ourselves in denial. We want to think people will ultimately do the right thing. The bystanders will not remain indifferent if only they understood exactly what was happening.
Just one more question, then we'll take some others. What about just the denial among Jewish academics? That's the sociology or psychology or
we signed up for this, right? Professor Nelson, Professor Goldbrenner. I don't know. I'm sure there are many more professors here. I just don't know all of you. But we signed up as people who have committed our careers to that notion of the Enlightenment ideal of knowledge and action, moral action, ethical, moral, and intellectual right behavior. And unfortunately, this province of knowledge, and here's what ISGAP really is contributing, it's creating an intellectual framework, a conceptual framework, as Charles is calling it, that exposes some of that, and therefore it is a vital contribution to the way we think about our commitments and our commitments today and our institutions.
So let's open it up. Does anybody have any comments, questions? Just put your hands up so I can see them. Give me a heads up, people.
We have Charles Rose and Richard Landis with their hands up, Bill.
Okay, so Charles, let's go with you first, and then we'll go to Richard. Yeah.
I'd like to go away from the academic place, because I'm not an academic, even though I have a doctorate in engineering.
That you call,
I'm a big believer in the truth, which I always believe in, and I speak a fluent Yiddish and a fluent Hebrew. But let me take it to a different level. I spent this past Sunday. I just want to give an anecdote. I spent this past Sunday at UJ Federation, New York, had their annual congressional breakfast with all the politicians of New York State. Many of them being Muslims, many of them being welcomed by many of the Jewish community. Many of these Muslim politicians openly trashing the Jewish people and Jewish state. And what I find amazing is that even though I did have the pleasure of reading Ruth Weiss's book, Free as a Jew, about what was going on at Harvard when she decided to leave, I think what's going on in the Jewish community as a whole is a broader denial of our political leadership and a degradation of our Jewish values that's much broader than just the academic institutions. It's much deeper than this.
Daniel, do you want to address that a little bit?
I'll leave that. That's something that you're better positioned to respond
It's
to.
very deep. The political system, both on the left and the right, are doing a lot of damage to our Jewish identity. They're doing a lot of damage.
Mhm.
And the Jewish people are not even, they're basically aligned with these political forces rather than with their Jewish identity. They're just ridiculous.
Sobering, Charles, sobering. Richard, yeah, what do you share with us? Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like you, Daniel, if you could, to distinguish two things that you've spoken about. One is this, shall we say, public secret that we won't talk about it, but everybody knows about it, that was so stunningly illustrated. And I'd love to get a copy of that speech, because I work on this stuff. But between that on the one hand and on the other hand, and in connection to it, the denial that, I deny I'm an anti-Semite, which I think you may give too much credit to it as a long-standing thing rather than a post-Holocaust thing. I think that being an anti-Semite was openly embraced, and where the Nazis fall silent, it's on the extermination and not on admitting to racism. Racism was openly embraced before the Holocaust. So there's that on one side. And then on the other side, where I don't think you gave enough examples, you talk about blaming the Jews. Now, that's a terribly important thing. And your example from Sweden, there's another example, a stunning piece, which I cite of, I forget his name, but a British journalist interviewing a woman after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris. And she says, it feels like the 30s. And he says, well, the Palestinians, and he brings up the Palestinians as if to say, it's your fault. So I offer that as another example. But in any case, it seems to me that you need to conceptually separate these two things. And I'll leave it at that.
Daniel,
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent points, Richard. And I'd be very pleased to offline to discuss these matters further, especially the relationship or the use of the Holocaust and Himmler as sort of as instructive for us. The 2 points, I think you're absolutely right. I agree with you, and I thank you for the constructive criticism. Caveat: this is not what my participation, my activities for ISGAP have. This is sort of something I'm just developing these ideas here. I've worked on other elements, things that I and Bill are far more expert in. Let's put the caveat aside. I wanted to respond to the two things. One, the denial or sort of what you said about anti-Semites often being very proud, and this is certainly true. A good, to say someone who's a good anti-Semite was in previous generations, especially in Nazi Germany, a mark of approbation. This was a compliment. What they also said, and this is I think very again sort of stunningly, shockingly stated by Himmler, but you can find this in so many other contexts, is that this didn't compromise their virtue. This made them good people, and that to note this, to take that action, as hard as it was, is to actually show your patriotism. And I think that fellow, that older, that middle-aged Austrian in the middle of Vienna, saying the same thing, like, let's finally stop kowtowing to the Jews and let's tell things the way they are. The second point that's the sort of denial and the secrecy on the one hand, with decency on the other hand. There are many, many examples. Charlie Hebdo and the Swiss one, the Swedish one that I introduced. There are so many where to accuse the Jews of their own destruction. This is, now that we're talking directly amongst ourselves, the most blatant, the most painful, and probably also the most common example of this, expression of this, is that Jews are today's Nazis, right?
Right,
That
right.
Jews
Holocaust
are,
inversion.
the Jews not only, as that fellow in Austria was saying, were responsible for the Holocaust, but that actually they are carrying out the only real Holocaust today. That's why Lavrov said, we need to denazify Ukraine, this country led by Jews. That Hitler himself, Lavrov said, I think that Hitler might have had some Jewish blood, and that the Jews are today's Nazis vis-a-vis certainly the Palestinians, but the dispossessed of today. That is a way of attacking precisely at at the most sensitive place.
Thank you. Let's hear from Carrie Nelson. Hi, Carrie.
Thank you. You've given me a lot to think about, especially since I've written a book called Israel Denial. So I've thought about that word a bit. It's a complex locution, but I think part of what you've helped me think about a bit today is how the statement, I deny I'm an anti-Semite and I deny Israel's right to exist, might come together and be mutually interdependent. But even saying that, what you've done, I think, is two things. One is you've wanted to suggest a certain lineage over not just 70 years, but certainly 70 years, in part because of that wretched Himmler talk, which bothers me every time I hear it. I can't seem to get indifferent to it. And the decades since, it's a mixture of a lineage and something like a free-floating metaphor, denial, a free-floating metaphor that attaches itself to a lot of different contexts without a direct lineage at stake. So just what I'm asking is, have you thought about the relationship between those two models, the denial as an historical sequence and denial as a very mobile and flexible metaphor?
Excellent points, and thank you for helping develop these ideas. And I'm glad, if anything, I looked at, I think also of your book and also Bob Wistrich's updating of Deborah Lipstadt. He wrote a book about Holocaust denial about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, that also I found it constructive. So it's an honor to get your ideas. In terms of just initial responses, and we can certainly continue this conversation. I hope we do, because these are sort of as I said at the beginning, sort of the nuanced and untheorized, our world of literature, we can use that word, sort of under-theorized background to anti-Semitism, to denial. You're right. There is no external correlative. There is no proximate cause. And so it is this sort of free-floating phenomenon. And I think that the point that something I brought up with Bill a couple of weeks ago after the January 27th panel is that just as the Nazis, and I share with him some examples also, again, from my own expertise, put out all these, they call it race theory, race science, as they were very sincere about, and they believed, and not just they, but British and Americans also believed, was sort of the apogee of biological sciences at the time, and that Jews themselves were not a real people. They, in fact, were not even real human. It was a way of denying their authenticity, it denied their standing. So too today, with sort of, this is again from the left, but it also exists on the right of nationalist anti-Semitism. But on the left, the idea of denying the Jews, denying Jewish racial identity, that Jews are not themselves, Jews are white, Jews are not any, Jews have no racial identity. All Jews of all backgrounds, whether you're Taimani or Ethiopian, or no matter how dark your skin, no matter how impoverished your background, you're still white and an oppressor of the rest of the world, is another way of simply writing Jews out of the contemporary discussions of power and weakness. This is the idea that that some of us have been talking about, of what is on the practitioner's part disingenuous, but they mean it entirely, anti-racist anti-Semitism. the anti-Semitism of anti-racism. And I think that your remarks and some of what we're talking about together contribute to those ideas.
Daniel, let me share a question from Chloe Pinto, one of our Cambridge scholars. What is the relationship between repression and denial in this context? At the level of the individual or the institution? It seems like it would follow off on what you were just saying. The relationship between repression and denial. Chloe, did you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Chloe, do you mean repression in psychoanalytic sense?
Maybe Chloe's driving or something. 1 second, she says in the chat. And
let's come back to her in a minute.
I'm here. Hi. Hello, everybody. Hi. Thank you so much for such a brilliant talk. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on, as I say, the relationship between repression and denial as techniques, as perhaps a driving force, and following on from the brilliant question that was just asked, how that might shift at the level of the individual and at the level of institution. So any thoughts on this would be much appreciated.
Yeah. I just think it's something as I'm recommending. I don't have anything definitive to say, and I'm really not trying to be excessively modest. It's something that all of us are confronting and trying to think through. And it is a very confusing, perhaps the most prevalent, but the most self-contradictory aspect of it, which is why it's something that I wanted to talk about today, that we can find, or we can either directly confront or learn of these behaviors and statements, both individually and from collectives, from institutions that are out and out to us, to our mind, anti-Semitic, and yet they'll be justified with these equally sincere. I don't think that they're being themselves disingenuous, just as Himmler was not. No, that's not anti-Semitic. I don't have a bad bone against in my body. I in fact admire Jews. I just know that they are responsible for destroying humanity. And you can see that in that Utah businessman's remarks. You can find it in context after context that we are taking these efforts and we admire, and that there's the good Jew, right? The good Jew is what is as Hitler said, the prima Jew, the Jew of today, the one who is willing to show contempt for Israel, who is willing to show up at those federation meetings and completely disavow all claims on Jewish sovereignty and Jewish power. Those are the good Jews. Everyone short of that, we're just waiting for the Jews to come around. We're waiting for the rest of you to come around on that point.
So that means that what progresses will, in the end, also not be spared. I mean, I'd hate to use the analogy, but right.
Yeah, or patriots on the right. That there's that Jews can never become full patriots. They always are actually working to subvert the state in France and Germany and in the United States and elsewhere.
Okay, great. Our hour's up, but let's take a few more questions. Vivian?
Hi, I'm sitting in pajamas, so I think it's a better idea if I just don't put on my camera. My concern more than anything else is the self-hating Jew. And I think the perfect understanding of this is if you watch You People, that whole idea of we are entitled, we are privileged, we are blind to other people's needs or what. I mean, it is the most horrific movie if you really look at it sort of frame by frame of all these self-hating Jews really who want to be Black or want to be whatever they want to be. It's anything but Jewish, it's, what is it, ABJ? And this is prevalent on campuses. This is, I know that my 3 kids have all had just horrendous experiences on various campuses. My daughter, who's in law school, was told by indigenous professors that deforestation is much more serious than the Holocaust ever was. That's just that's just one small example. And I mean, kavod to my kid who's been fighting it back, but that self-hating woke Jew, that is something that is so insidious, and it's that really is, how do we go about dealing with that particular kind of issue? That's really more than anything else. When we hate ourselves, it's so hard for anybody else to anybody who's like off on the sides to really come to see our point of view. That's really just what I wanted to feel that.
Thank you. Daniel, you and I, we've spent a lot of time in this university world, and we didn't give Daniel's full introduction before that. He was trained at Yale in the 90s or the early 2000s. So that means he was kind of in the belly of the beast to some extent. So his knowledge is definitely firsthand of this. Whatever, I was at Columbia, maybe that's the belly of the beast. Columbia was more historicism. Yale was more post-structuralism, deconstruction. Daniel, so what are your thoughts?
These ideas of turning Jews against themselves is itself, it's a function of anti-Semitism that's been practiced. I find, Vivian, you might want to share this with your kids. They can discuss it with their colleagues back on campus. That has itself a 2,000-year-old history. This is something they were talking about before the Churban, about are we Jewish, hating Jewish, who's responsible for all of this? It itself has a very long history. There's a great work from the 1920s that one of my professors at Yale made me read. Isaac Deutscher, My Life as a Self-Hating Jew, from the 1920s in Germany. So itself, self-hating Judaism, as aggravating as it is, has both a history. It itself is part of, they are themselves victims. To be turned against yourself is this sort of moral or identity jujitsu that is practiced by anti-Semitism. And I would actually make it a corollary of what we're talking about here, that no, I'm not anti-Semitic. I just think that you need to act a little differently. We could be friends. You can come into the club if you just, if Herman just didn't have if he didn't act so obviously Jewish, right? There are movies after movies, there's histories of this and books, and you can read about it in Alexandria, Hanukkah, the history in the first century, in the 19th century, 20th century. Leopoldstadt, this wonderful play in the West End as well as on Broadway, is all about this idea as well. It itself has a very venerable history, and honestly has not itself been fully theorized because it is confusing. It's very confusing.
So I think you might have just answered part of Chloe's question, that is the relationship between repression and denial, that there is, and really dovetails with some of the other things that people have been saying, that denial comes with a certain kind of necessary repression of Jewish identity on campus. So somebody asked, how come we don't have an international Jewish think tank to research and fight anti-Semitism? That's a great idea. We're looking for donors. One final set of questions. Is the university salvageable, Daniel? I mean, are the colleagues who we're referring to, see, it's different for Daniel and I, because a lot of the people we're referring to as these woke progressives are people we were in school with, right? They have faces to us, and in many cases they have good faces to us. I mean, maybe that's part of the problem, right? Is the humanities, can it be saved from the anti-Semitism which seems to define it now?
Here my optimism prevails. I think so. I think that part of what this discussion, as long as it'd be wonderful to have this conversation, not just in ISGAP. If Professor Nelson and others who've done very heroic work could find interlocutors for this in, I don't know, in our field, ACLA and MLA and AHA, then you have, that the faith that I'm expressing is well founded. Because we're just raising ideas. I'm not accusing really anybody of anything. I'm not even as pointed as Bill as you are, perhaps with greater experience as you find justified. But I think that I believe that thinking these ideas through, showing a genealogy, offering some hypotheses of explanation, and then in conversation with many other people, testing them, seeing what makes sense, having it peer-reviewed, is the work of both ISGAP and is the work of, university scholars. That is what we do to try to understand those most confusing and pressing, those most urgent matters of humanities. That's what humanities still is. And I still do believe it has a chance, but yes, it is increasingly difficult. But I see people are raising their eyebrows. Maybe I'm just naive.
Well, so we have to remember, Daniel, as we remind each other, that the rabbi said, long ago, that just because it seems futile and hopeless, meaning you can't finish the task, doesn't mean you can give up on it. And I think ISGAP is very much part of that. First, there's one more question I'll paraphrase from Lawrence, but really just thank you for that exemplary talk in terms of really very much fitting into the framework that was created for the series. And also, as Alberto picks up on, this is something that needs to be developed further. And Daniel, as he points out, is one of many, many, many voices. I also think, Daniel, just the theoretical and sophistication that you bring to this shows the extent to which, in some ways, anti-Semitism studies is far, far behind studies in race and gender and other things, where the same kind of theoretical language that Chloe used last week, that you're using now, is now becoming available. And these languages, it's strange because these languages are very often the province of the very left we're criticizing. But with that said, we can still use them as a tool to understand anti-Semitism. So maybe we'll just end with this. Lawrence wants to know, there still is a differentiation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, mostly by the left and extreme left, at least in France where he lives. It is a very perverse way to deny their own anti-Semitism. Does it exist the same way in the US? Yeah, so Daniel's kids are waiting, so this will be the last question, Daniel, yeah? Sound. You're muted, Daniel. You're muted.
Sorry, thank you. It's very it's a question that it's ubiquitous because it's one that there is no one answer, but you'll find many voices regarding this. We always need to raise, we always need to raise the point. Criticism of any country is legitimate. Denial of a country is not. That's the difference of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic, between anti-Zionism or criticism of Zionism and then anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. The current government of Israel, the young government, is taking many steps that you will find millions of people protesting. Who are those millions of people? Israeli citizens. They are themselves Jews and do not deny the legitimacy of the state. So this is the big question. I invite anybody who is wrestling with it to join the conversation. It's one that we all need to think about. We live in Jews have always lived in ancient times. That's the famous Yiddish joke has it. And becoming conversant, becoming active in those debates is something that all of you who are here, all of us who are here, are trying to take seriously. And it's not one that anyone, as Bill said, quoting the tractate of the forefathers, the sages, not the job of any of us to finish, but to which we can all contribute. So I thank you very much, Bill, especially, and Charles for the invitation. To all of you for your participation and wonderful comments. And I hope that this conversation can continue with in the many modalities that the Institute allows. So thank you. I apologize for any distractions, and thank you all.
We enjoyed the distractions immensely, Daniel. Thank you for letting us into your office, into your study. And I think just to conclude, I think you've made us all think a lot about this term denial. And Carrie and Chloe, from their different perspectives, maybe helping us unpack that and seeing how important it is really in the study of anti-Semitism. Daphne, do we have a coming attraction here, or to close up?
We have the seminar series every Tuesday at 10 a.m. So next week, I believe we have Joel Finkelstein. Don't quote me on that. I will be emailing everybody with that link and also the recording for this lecture so that you can share with your friends. And I hope to see all of you next week, 10 a.m. Same time, same place.
If it is,
Joel is next week.
If it is, Joel is next week. So I would really encourage any of you who are interested in really one of the primary activities of ISGAP, which has been involved with trying to follow the money. That is to see the way in which dirty money, mostly from Qatar and other places, has infiltrated the university. Daniel and I actually worked together with Joel. We were kind of providing the data sources, that is keywords, key movements, key journals, key publications, and to see how those key publications, all associated with an anti-Semitic left, have been encouraged by, or is there a correlation between the money that goes in and anti-Semitism on campuses? And Joel will show you in astonishing ways that that is in fact the case. So look forward to seeing everybody next week. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Daphne, and El Shaddai. Kol HaKavod. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.